debris drifting after the storm. But when the poor fisherman opened the doors of the red container, his life turned in a different direction. What happened next was something he wasn't prepared for. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The morning began the way so many others had for him, quiet and heavy, as though the world had not yet decided whether to wake or remain suspended in darkness. His small house sat only a few blocks from the shoreline, where the salt hung in the air like a permanent mist. Inside, everything was modest and worn from years of use. The man who lived there had long grown accustomed to making things last far beyond their natural lifespan. He rose before dawn, as he always did, moving carefully so as not to wake his mother in the next room. Her shallow breathing filtered faintly through the cracked door, a reminder that time moved in only one cruel direction. Her illness had been slow but relentless, carving away at her strength year after year. The medications she needed were expensive, the doctor visits even more so, and his wages were never enough to keep up. Still, he tried. Every day, every dawn, every cast of the nets into the uncertain ocean. His name was Elijah Brooks, though most people in the old coastal town simply called him Eli. He had lived here his whole life. The wooden boards of the docks, the cries of gulls circling the harbor, the sway of boats rising and falling with the tide, these were the sounds and sights of his childhood. His father had been a fisherman before him, and his grandfather before that. The Brooks family had salt water in their blood. Eli had never imagined leaving the town, though many had told him he should. People said that fishing wasn't a life anymore, not the kind that could sustain a person in these unforgiving economic times. But Eli clung to the ocean with the same stubborn determination he carried for everything else. The sea was hard, but it was honest. It gave what it could and withheld what it must. He respected that simplicity. He stepped outside into the dark blue half-light that came just before sunrise. His boots scuffed the dirt path as he made his way toward the harbor. The familiar weight of his old canvas jacket hung around his shoulders, patched in 3 different places. He had meant to buy a new one last winter, but life had a way of rearranging his priorities. Food came first, medicine next. Repairs on the boat after that. Everything else fell to the bottom of the list. The town was quiet at this hour. A lone street lamp flickered near the boarded-up entrance of what used to be a bait shop. Years ago, it had been run by a cheerful old man who used to greet Eli with stories of storms and sharks and wild catches. Now the building was dark, the windows nailed shut, a casualty of dwindling customers and rising costs. The entire town had faded in much the same way. Paint peeled from the clapboard houses along the shore. Several storefronts stood empty. Even the bar by the port, the one place that had once been alive every evening, was no longer guaranteed to host more than a handful of weary fishermen. Eli nodded to a solitary figure sitting on a bench near the pier. Old Raymond, another fisherman past his prime, lifted his hand in greeting. He no longer went out to sea. His back had given out the previous year. He spent his mornings watching the boats leave, drinking weak coffee from a chipped thermos. Eli returned the nod but kept walking. Words would come later, maybe after the day was done. For now, he wanted silence. His small boat waited at the far end of the pier, tied to a weathered piling. The vessel had once been a handsome thing, painted bright blue with white trim, but time and salt had stripped most of its color. The paint flaked off at the slightest touch. The boards creaked under the slightest shift of weight. Even the name, Faithful Star, was only half visible now, the rest scoured away by years of rough currents. Still, it floated, That was more than enough. Eli climbed aboard and checked his nets, his gear, and the small outboard motor. The motor was the part he trusted least. It sputtered and coughed even when it was warm, and at dawn, when everything was cold and damp, it often needed coaxing. He had repaired it as many times as a man could without replacing it entirely, and sometimes he swore it held together only out of stubbornness, mirroring its owner. As he worked, he thought of his mother. The previous night she had suffered a coughing fit so intense he had worried she might stop breathing. When it finally passed, she had told him not to look at her with such fear in his eyes. She said she had survived worse in her life, but Eli knew she said it only for his sake. Her body was frail, her voice thin as paper. Every day he didn't bring home enough money felt like another small failure. And with winter approaching, the need for fuel and warm clothing weighed on his mind like an anchor. The sky had begun to lighten, streaks of pale pink spreading across the horizon, when Eli finally coaxed the motor to life. The sound was uneven at first, a rough growl, but it steadied as he adjusted the throttle. Gulls wheeled overhead, watching him expectantly. They knew the rhythm of fishermen well. The early morning often meant scraps tossed from nets, and they hovered like impatient ghosts above the boat. Eli released the mooring rope and eased the boat away from the dock. Water lapped quietly against the hull. The silhouettes of other boats dotted the harbor, though only a few showed signs of life. Most people either had better equipment or had given up altogether. The town's fishing industry had fallen on hard times. Big commercial vessels had come in over the years, pulling entire schools of fish from the water before small boats like his ever had a chance. Regulations tightened. Expenses rose. Each season felt worse than the last. But Eli kept going because he had no choice. Because someone had to keep the tradition alive. Because the ocean still felt like home. Once he cleared the breakwater, he steered Faithful Star into open water. The swell was gentle, though the weather forecast had hinted at shifting winds and possible rough seas by afternoon. Eli preferred to return before storms formed, but sometimes the sea had its own plans. He scanned the horizon, looking for signs of changes in the sky. The clouds were a dull gray, layered thickly like blankets pulled low across the heavens. Nothing unusual yet. He continued farther out, letting his thoughts drift with the steady thrum of the motor. He thought about the little he needed to accomplish today. Catch something, anything, that could help buy the medicine his mother needed by the end of the week. He thought about the loan for the engine, the one he was already late on. He thought about the call he needed to make to his ex-wife who had texted him earlier asking about school shoes for their daughter. Every responsibility weighed heavily on him. He sometimes wondered if he had done something wrong to deserve such endless struggle, but then reminded himself that life played favorites with no one. Some were born into comfort. Others were born fighting currents the moment they took their first breath. He reached his usual spot, a place his father had once trusted in lean times. The sea felt familiar here, as though it recognized him. He cut the engine and let the boat drift. The quiet that followed struck him deeply. No engine noise, no voices, only the soft slap of water and the distant cries of birds. He cast the nets with practiced ease, feeling the old rhythm settle into his muscles. Time passed slowly. He worked with patient movements, checking the lines, adjusting the nets, staring into the water for any sign of life below. As the sun climbed, the light grew stronger, shimmering across the waves. But the fish did not come. They hadn't in days. The nets remained frustratingly light. Eli sighed and rubbed a hand across his face. Fatigue rolled through him like a tide, though the day had just begun. He pulled the nets in again, folded them, and considered whether to try another spot. He glanced around, studying the vast expanse of water, and that was when he saw it. An unfamiliar shape rising and sinking in the swell about a quarter-mile away. At first, he dismissed it as driftwood or a broken buoy, but the more he looked, the clearer the outline became. Rectangular, squat, too large to be anything ordinary. The hair on the back of his neck prickled as he narrowed his eyes, leaning forward. It was a shipping container, a lone, rusted giant rocking gently on the open sea. Its once bright red paint was scraped and peeling, its metal sides streaked from months, maybe longer, of exposure to salt water. It sat low in the water, almost too low, the ocean lapping dangerously close to its top edge. Eli blinked, unsure for a moment whether he was seeing correctly through the haze of distance. Containers sometimes fell overboard during storms, everyone knew that. But rarely did one drift this intact, this close to shore. The bay currents sometimes carried strange things, but nothing quite like this. He started the engine again, hesitating only long enough to weigh the risks. Approaching a drifting object of that size could be dangerous. His boat was small and would not survive a collision, but the container pulled at him with an odd gravity. It felt out of place, almost unnatural, as though it didn't belong here and the ocean was trying to decide what to do with it. Maybe there was nothing inside but waterlogged junk. Maybe the contents had long since rotted or dissolved. Maybe it had floated for years, forgotten and meaningless. Yet curiosity tugged at Eli with stubborn persistence. He imagined scrap metal value. He imagined being able to sell it, or at least tow it closer to shore. He imagined luck, something he hadn't tasted in far too long. And behind all those practical thoughts lay something deeper, something unsaid. A quiet whisper from the darkest corners of his mind, telling him that fate did not place such a thing in his path for no reason. He slowly turned the boat toward the drifting red shape, watching as waves shimmered around it like a warning or a welcome. He didn't know it yet, but his life had already begun to shift. The sea around him was the same, the sky unchanged, the wind still light. But fate had already chosen its moment. He guided the boat closer, feeling the gentle pull of something bigger than himself. As Faithful Star pushed forward through the water, Eli Brooks felt the weight of the years behind him and the stir of something unimaginable ahead. The sea, which had always been a place of routine and struggle, seemed suddenly filled with possibility. And as the container loomed larger in front of him, rocking silently in the pale morning light, he could not shake the feeling that nothing about today would be ordinary. The container rose before him like some rust-scarred monolith, a silent giant adrift between the shifting gray of the sky and the restless motion of the sea. As Eli eased his small boat closer, the sound of the water slapping against the corroded metal sides echoed faintly, creating a hollow, mournful rhythm. It was strange how something so lifeless could still give the impression of watching him approach, as if waiting to see what choice he would make. Eli felt a tightness grow in his chest, a mixture of excitement and unease. He could not yet know whether this moment would be remembered as the beginning of his salvation or the start of a mistake so large it would follow him for the rest of his days. He throttled back the engine, letting the Faithful Star drift closer under the push of the current. The smell hit him first. A sharp tang of rust, salt, and something older he couldn't name. The container had clearly spent months at sea. Barnacles clustered along its lower edges like pale, craggy parasites clinging to a dying host. Seaweed trailed from the corners in long green streamers, waving gently with the movement of the ocean. The red paint, once bold and bright, was now cracked and faded, peeling away in long strips that fluttered lightly with each passing breeze. Eli circled carefully, giving himself time to study it from every angle. The water around it churned oddly, as though the weight inside shifted with each swell. He could feel the strain even before he touched a rope. Whatever was in there hadn't dissolved or floated away. It was still intact, still heavy. That alone raised more questions than answers. And yet none of those questions outweighed the immediate, undeniable fact. This might be the chance he had been waiting for, the stroke of luck that had eluded him for so long. But taking hold of the container would not be simple. His boat was small, barely sturdy enough to manage its own haul of nets on stormy days, and this object dwarfed the faithful star. If he misjudged a wave or snagged a rope incorrectly, his vessel could be dragged sideways or capsized in an instant. The very thought sent a chill creeping up his spine. His mother would never survive losing him. His daughter would grow up without knowing the man who loved her fiercely, even from afar. The stakes were enormous, yet the possibility of turning away didn't feel real. He had found something, and Fisherman did not leave potential fortune floating in the open sea. He stood for a long moment, gripping the side of his boat, feeling the wood creak beneath his hands. The ocean hummed around him as though whispering that it had offered him something rare and unpredictable. He inhaled deeply, tasting salt and tension in the air, then reached for the coil of rope he kept wound beneath the bench. His father had once taught him the knots and tricks needed to tow derelict traps or lost buoys, and though this was far beyond anything he had practiced, the motions came back to him with surprising clarity. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from an electric anticipation that made the world feel strangely sharp and alive. Bracing his feet against the deck, Eli cast the rope toward one of the metal bars protruding from the container's upper edge. The throw was awkward, and the rope fell short, plopping uselessly into the water. Eli cursed under his breath and pulled it back in. He tried again. This time, the rope snagged the corner, sliding against the rusted surface before slipping free. He wiped his palms on his jacket, feeling the weight of the moment pressing harder with every failed attempt. Finally, on the fourth try, the loop caught securely on a jagged latch near the edge of the container. Eli pulled hard, testing the connection. The rope held. Relief washed over him in a warm pulse, though it was tempered immediately by the realization that this was only the beginning. The moment he began pulling, the container would respond. Its movement would dictate the outcome, not his will. His job now was simply to adapt and hope that the faithful star would survive the strain. He tied the rope to the reinforced cleat near the stern and wiped his brow. Feeling the sweat mix with ocean spray, he turned to the motor, hesitant. If the engine failed now, if it sputtered and died as it sometimes did under stress, the boat would be at the mercy of the container's weight, the waves deciding their fate without pity. Eli felt a tremor of doubt, but it evaporated as quickly as it came. He had made his choice. There was no sense lingering on what-ifs. He started the motor. The familiar coffin roar filled the air, followed by a throaty vibration that settled into a steady rhythm only after a tense few seconds. Eli adjusted the throttle, nudging the boat forward gently. The rope tightened, lifting slightly from the water before jerking downward again as the container resisted. The faithful star shuddered violently. Eli felt the tremor through his boots, up his legs, and into his bones. He gritted his teeth and eased the throttle again, coaxing rather than forcing. The boat crept forward inch by inch. The container slipped through the water behind him reluctantly at first, then with growing momentum. The drag was immense. Eli could feel it like a physical hand gripping the back of his vessel, pulling him toward the water's depths. He kept his eyes fixed on the shoreline, which shimmered faintly in the hazy distance. If he could just get the container close enough to the old pier, just to that one sheltered stretch of the coast, he could beach it before anyone else saw, before anyone claimed it, before fate changed its mind. He steered toward the more secluded stretch of shoreline to the east, where an abandoned pier leaned into the water like a forgotten relic of better years. The beams were rotted and jagged, but beneath them lay a shallow sandbar, a place where currents slowed and debris often gathered. Eli had used the spot once before to repair his nets away from prying eyes. It wasn't a part of the main harbor, and few fishermen bothered with it. It was quiet, overlooked, and exactly what he needed. The journey toward shore felt agonizingly slow. Every swell of the waves sent a ripple of strain through the rope and a jolt up Eli's spine. The engine protested frequently, coughing and rattling as though the effort might cause it to tear itself apart. Eli whispered encouragement to the machine, absurd as it was, because faith in the old motor was all that kept him from turning around and abandoning the entire mad endeavor. The gulls circling overhead seemed to shriek warnings, or perhaps encouragement. It was impossible to tell. As the minutes dragged on, Eli's arms and shoulders began to ache from the constant tension of balancing his weight and controlling the boat's course. Sweat dripped down his temples despite the cold wind. He felt the sting of salt in his eyes and blinked it away. The container played no favorites. Every foot gained was a victory, every moment an argument fought against the forces of nature. Halfway to the pier, the waters became choppier. The sky overhead darkened slightly, hinting at the change the forecast had promised. A gust of wind hit the faithful star broadside, tipping it dangerously before Eli corrected the course, heart thundering. For a terrifying instant, he imagined the rope snapping, sending the container drifting freely into deeper waters until it vanished forever. Or worse, the rope might hold, and the sudden force could yank the small boat sideways, capsizing it with shocking ease. He steadied his breath and focused on keeping a straight path. The pier drew closer with excruciating slowness, its silhouette sharpening into broken lines of timber and shadow. Nearly there, he told himself. Nearly. The last 100 yards felt like a battle against time itself. The waves had grown livelier, slapping the hull with increased vigor. The engine groaned louder than before, rattling violently as if each rotation might be its last. Eli could see the sandbar now. The water shifted color near the shallows, turning from deep green to murkier brown. He adjusted course carefully, pulling the container toward the place where the tide was weakest. When the container struck the first rise of the sandbar, he felt it through the rope, a dull, heavy thud that vibrated through the line and into the boat. Eli exhaled a shaky breath. The worst was over. Now he only needed to drag it a few more feet, just enough for it to sit firmly on the sand and remain in place even after he untied the rope. He eased the throttle one last time. The container scraped forward, settling unevenly with a harsh metallic groan. Eli steered slightly to adjust its angle. Another groan, another few feet of progress. Then the container stopped moving, wedged securely against the rising slope of the sandbar. Eli killed the engine and sagged forward against the controls, drained but triumphant. The stillness that followed felt unreal after the long tension of the tow. His arms throbbed, His muscles quivered from exertion. And yet, a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He had done it. The impossible. He had taken something massive and unpredictable and brought it under his control, at least for the moment. As he stepped out into the knee-deep water, wading toward the red colossus resting at last upon the sandbar, he looked around instinctively. No other boats were nearby. No one had seen. The coastline was empty, gray, quiet. The abandoned pier loomed over him like a guardian, its long shadows stretching across the beach. He approached the container, trailing a hand along its cold, barnacle-covered surface. Each step brought a deeper sense that what he had done was more significant than he yet understood. The container felt like a sealed secret, heavy with the weight of untold stories. Whatever lay inside might change nothing, or might change everything. For now, though, he was simply grateful it was here, on this desolate stretch of shore where only he knew of its existence. The hardest task had been completed, but as Eli gazed at the rusted door, he felt a subtle shift in his own heartbeat, a distant echo of anticipation. He had brought the container to land. The question now was whether he was ready to face whatever waited behind that corroded steel door. The container stood before him like a slumbering beast, its rusted skin mottled with years of corrosion and its massive door sealed shut by time and salt. Eli stared at the metal structure, chest rising and falling in slow, heavy breaths. The tension of the toe still vibrated faintly through his muscles. Now that the adrenaline had begun to ebb, exhaustion settled over him like an invisible cloak, but beneath it simmered something sharper. Anticipation, nervous and electric. The container was real, tangible, enormous, and it was his. He had pulled it from the open water with his own hands and the stubborn will that had defined his life for as long as he could remember. Yet, what came next felt even more daunting than the impossible journey that had brought the container to shore. He walked a slow circle around it, feeling the water recede from his boots as the tide rolled back. The sand sucked lightly at his feet with each step. The morning sun was climbing, casting long shadows from the decaying beams of the abandoned pier across the red hull of the container. In the quiet that followed the tow, the ocean's voice had changed from the roar of effort to the soft, rhythmic murmur of waves licking the shore. It was easier now to sense just how silent the rest of the world was around him. No other boats approached. No footsteps broke the stillness. The town lay far enough away that even the usual noises, distant engines, chatter from the docks, the occasional honk of a passing truck, felt muted by distance. All this isolation might have terrified another man, but for Eli it was strangely reassuring. He needed space. He needed time. Whatever waited inside this steel vault, he preferred to face it alone before bringing anyone else into the equation. His fingers brushed over the dents and gashes along the container's sides. Close up, the damage looked worse than it had from the boat. Sections of paint had peeled away entirely, leaving raw, pitted metal exposed beneath. Certain areas bore deep scratches that looked like they had been made by something sharp and powerful, another container smashing against it during a storm, perhaps, or part of a ship's hull scraping against it before it was jettisoned. Some indentations were so severe that Eli wondered how the structure had remained watertight at all. Water had seeped into the corners, leaving trails of rust that ran like dried blood down the metal. He reached the door, the heavy, thick panel that guarded the secrets inside. The locking mechanism was a twisted, corroded mess. The metal bars looked fused in places, and barnacles had formed clusters along the edges. Whatever had once been painted instructions or identifiers had been worn away, leaving only faint shadows of lettering. Only the most determined effort would pry it open now. But he was nothing if not determined. He stepped back, surveying the problem, and then trudged up the beach to retrieve the small set of tools he had brought from his boat. He had collected them in a hurry, thinking mostly of utility: a weathered crowbar, a hammer whose handle had been wrapped in black tape years ago, a pair of thick gloves, and a lantern-style flashlight. None of these tools were ideal for breaking into a steel shipping container, but they were all he had, and the ocean was not going to hold this secret open for him. It would remain silent until he forced it to speak. He approached the container again, dropped the tools beside him, and stared at the door. The significance of the moment pressed against him with strange gravity. This could be trash or treasure, danger or deliverance. It could be nothing more than a crate filled with ruined electronics, or worse, something rotten and unrecognizable. But it could also be something else entirely, something rarer, something that no one in this town, or perhaps in several towns, had ever seen. The sun glinted faintly off the barnacles, and Eli took that as a sign that it was time to begin. He slid his gloves on, feeling the leather stretch stiffly around his fingers, and lifted the crowbar. The first strike of metal on metal reverberated like a deep gong echoing through the empty air. The sound startled him with its volume, but he didn't stop. He wedged the crowbar into the seam where the door met the frame, pushing with slow, deliberate force. The rust resisted, clinging to what remained of the door's original structure. He adjusted his grip, braced one foot against the container for leverage, and heaved with all his strength. Nothing budged. He grunted, wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his arm, repositioned the crowbar, and tried again. This time he heard something shift, a faint creak, subtle but real. That small victory fueled him. He attacked the door again with renewed vigor, alternating between hammer blows and prying motions. Each movement took something out of him. Every muscle in his arms and shoulders burned. Sweat trickled down his spine despite the cool breath of seawater-laced wind. Bit by bit, the door surrendered. A groan escaped the metal, long and pained, like the cry of some deep-sea creature disturbed from its slumber. Eli paused to catch his breath, heart pounding as the first few flakes of rust drifted down like red dust. He could see the seam widening, fraction by fraction, enough to let the stale odor trapped inside seep through in tiny ghosts of air. It wasn't the foul smell he had feared, no rot, no decay, just the dense, damp aroma of old wood, fabric, and minerals. He pried again. The door shifted another inch. Another groan. Then, with one final, desperate surge of strength, the hinge snapped with a crack that echoed across the beach. The door lurched open several inches and stopped abruptly, wedged by some internal obstruction. Eli ducked to peer into the dark slit beyond, raising the flashlight to illuminate whatever waited inside. At first, all he could see was shadow, thick, impenetrable blackness. He heard only his own breath, rough and unsteady. Then he stepped closer, shining the light through the narrow opening. Shapes emerged, tall, narrow forms, rounded silhouettes, the gleam of polished surfaces, colors dulled by darkness but still striking beneath the beam of the flashlight. Eli's eyes widened as he angled his head to see more. The shapes were too refined, too intentional, too carefully arranged to be the debris or junk he had expected. He took another step back and pushed against the door with both hands. It resisted, but after a moment it slid a little more open, scraping loudly along the grit lining the frame. The gap was large enough now for him to slip inside. He wedged a piece of driftwood under the door just in case the rusted hinge gave up completely. Then, with a breath that trembled despite his attempts to remain calm, he ducked into the container. The air inside was cool and heavy. It felt as though it had not been disturbed for months. Dust motes floated in his flashlight's beam, dancing slowly like tiny suspended stars. As his eyes adjusted, as the darkness peeled away inch by inch, he saw the truth of what waited inside. It wasn't trash. It wasn't machinery. It wasn't supplies or cheap goods lost at sea. It was a collection. Massive, deliberate, stunning. Along the left wall stood a row of tall stone sculptures, each secured with wide industrial straps that had miraculously held through storms and chaos. The statues were carved with incredible detail, faces with sharp features, robes flowing as if caught by invisible winds, patterns etched with a precision that only skilled artisans could produce. Dust and salt had dulled their surfaces, but the craftsmanship was unmistakable. Next to them, tucked between reinforced beams, were bronze pieces coated with the green patina of age. Some resembled ancient shields or ceremonial discs, others intertwined figures locked in frozen motion. Warriors, dancers, creatures that looked half human and half myth. Light glinted off their surfaces as Eli moved the flashlight, revealing the curves and textures of metal shaped by hands long gone. On the right side of the container sat wooden crates, some intact, others slightly warped but still sealed. A few had cracked from the impact of storms, and through the slats Eli could see hints of carved wood, animal masks with elongated features and delicate patterns, bowls with intricate geometric carvings, fragments of what looked like ornate furniture. Some crates were wrapped in water-resistant canvas, now frayed but still protecting the contents within. His breath caught in his throat. He walked deeper into the container, feeling the magnitude of the discovery press in on him. There was no mistaking what he was looking at. These were not modern replicas or souvenirs. This was cultural history, ancient, rare, and priceless. The kind of collection displayed behind glass in world-class museums or held in secretive private galleries that valued secrecy over legality. He reached out, hand trembling, and touched the corner of one of the stone statues. The surface was cool beneath his fingers, almost impossibly smooth given its age. He pulled his hand back quickly, as if he had violated something sacred. This was no ordinary cargo. This was the kind of cargo people killed for. His pulse quickened. For a moment, he felt dizzy, overwhelmed by the possibilities spiraling outward from this discovery. His mother could have the best care. His daughter could have everything she deserved. The debts that clung to him like anchors could vanish. Life could change with a single decision. But shadowing those dreams was a darker thought, creeping like a tide into the corners of his mind. If these items were stolen, and how could they not be? Someone would be looking for them, someone powerful, connected, and relentless. The ocean had not abandoned the container by accident. It had been thrown into its depths, hidden or discarded by those who had everything to lose. Eli swallowed hard, pushing through the rising panic. He continued deeper, unable to stop himself from examining every part of the container. The artifacts seemed endless, each more remarkable than the last. Some items were wrapped in delicate cloths inside wooden boxes. Others hung from custom-built frames. In one corner he found a water-resistant case, wedged tightly between two crates, sealed with latches meant to survive the elements. He crouched and unfastened it. The case opened with a hiss of released pressure. Inside were documents, manifests, shipping labels, letters, photographs. He lifted them carefully, grateful that most were laminated or protected in plastic sleeves. The faint smell of damp paper reached his nose, but the materials were surprisingly intact. He did not yet understand the magnitude of the storm he had stepped into, but as he sat surrounded by priceless artifacts and sealed evidence of an international criminal operation, one truth settled over him like a weight he could not shrug off. His life had just crossed a threshold. There was no going back. The air inside the container grew heavier as Eli sat amid the artifacts and documents, his flashlight beam trembling slightly with each breath he drew. His pulse pounded in his ears, adding a strange rhythm to the quiet that surrounded him. It was as though the world outside the steel walls had faded away, leaving him sitting at the center of an impossible discovery. The weight of what he had found had not yet settled fully upon him, but it pressed at the edges of his awareness like an approaching storm. The documents scattered in his lap were more than simple papers. They were keys. Keys to understanding what this floating vault of history truly represented, and keys to a future he was afraid to imagine. He lifted one laminated sheet, running a thumb along the edge as though afraid it might crumble despite its preserved condition. The manifest listed dozens of items, each described with unnerving precision. Stone effigies from West African regions scarred by recent conflict, bronze masks originating from an archaeological dig shut down years earlier due to accusations of illegal looting. Wooden ceremonial pieces traced to tribes whose artifacts had been disappearing for decades, fueling rumors of organized theft and black market exportation. Some entries included handwritten notes, initials, and coded markings he could not decipher, but could sense the meaning of. Smuggling, evasion, secrecy. The addresses printed on the shipping records were scattered across multiple countries, none of them matching the origin points of the pieces themselves. Many of the listed companies sounded vaguely legitimate: educational suppliers, cultural institutions, restoration workshops, but a few were suspiciously vague. Global Trade Partners, LLC, Westroot Holdings, Meridian Acquisitions, corporations with no websites, no real addresses, no history outside of paperwork designed for one purpose: to move contraband behind a screen of bureaucracy. Eli flipped through more documents, stopping on a series of scanned passports bearing unfamiliar faces, all men, all with faintly blurred features as though the printing software itself refused to render them fully real. Their names shifted from page to page. One man listed as Henry Albright on a delivery form, then as Hassan Al-Fayed on another, and then Marcel Dupoir on a third. It was clear these identities were fabricated, placeholders in an elaborate logistics web meant to confuse anyone who tried to trace the cargo's ownership. A chill crawled along Eli's spine. This wasn't a forgotten piece of educational freight or misrouted museum replicas. This was the underbelly of an international crime network, one that stole not just objects but history, culture, identity from nations built upon them. He wasn't a scholar, but he knew enough to recognize the gravity of the situation. These things weren't meant to be bought or sold. They were meant to be revered, protected, preserved where they belonged. He set the papers aside, drawing in a deep breath that tasted of dust and cold air. His mind drifted to the town, the broken pier, the empty shops, his mother coughing softly in her bedroom. He imagined her sitting at the small kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of warm tea because the house was always too cold now. He imagined his daughter tying her shoes with worn laces, pretending not to care that her classmates had nicer clothes. He thought of the debt collectors who called every week, their voices steady and unyielding. He thought of the work he did, day after day, scraping by on what little the ocean provided, All of it lay balanced against the silent wealth inside this container. He stood slowly, the flashlight beam sliding across the surfaces of the stone sculptures. They seemed to watch him, their carved eyes full of a quiet wisdom he couldn't escape. He thought of tribes whose stories had been carved into those artifacts. He imagined generations of people who had once stood before these pieces, seeing reflections of their gods, their ancestors, their very identity. He tried to envision how much pain must have followed when the pieces were taken, stolen, sold to men who cared nothing for the cultures they were tearing apart. Eli closed his eyes for a brief moment. His breath trembled in his chest. It was too much to sort through in a single morning. The world outside the container had not changed, yet every part of his life seemed suddenly more fragile, more breakable. He knelt before the documents again, feeling the sharp sting of conflicted desire and moral ache. The container's interior felt colder as he moved toward the entrance to let the sunlight in. The ocean glittered just beyond the open doorway, indifferent to everything it had carried to this beach. Waves rolled in and out, whispering their ancient secrets. Eli crouched in the entrance for a moment, letting the breeze wash over his face. He needed clarity, but his thoughts raced in a chaotic storm. He forced himself to catalog what he knew. These artifacts were stolen, illegally traded. They belonged to entire nations, to cultures that had already been wounded by exploitation. Yet, in his hands lay the possibility of turning his own life around, of rescuing his mother, of ensuring that his daughter had more than the scraps he could gather. His needs were real. His pain was real. But so was the weight of what taking any of these pieces for himself would mean. He left the container and walked along the shoreline, each step sinking into the wet sand. The container loomed behind him, massive and silent, its bright red paint glowing softly in the sun like a warning beacon. He moved slowly, needing the rhythm of walking to steady his mind. The abandoned pier cast long, jagged shadows across the sand, dark fingers stretching toward him as though urging him to turn back, to face what he had found. Eli's mind churned. What if he took a single item? Something small, valuable, easy to hide. Who would ever know? No one in this dying town would suspect him of having anything worth selling, and even if someone noticed, he could invent a story. A lucky catch. A souvenir passed down from a distant relative. People believed stranger things when they didn't care enough to question. But would he be able to live with himself? He pictured his father again, the tall man with calloused hands and quiet dignity who had taught him everything he knew about the ocean. His father had once refused to join a group of fishermen who were planning to poach from a restricted zone. Everyone else had gone, hungry for easy money. When they were caught, they blamed everything from bad luck to misunderstandings, but not one of them admitted the truth. His father had stood alone in the community for weeks while they whispered about his stubborn morality. But he had refused to compromise what he believed. He died poor, but he died with his self-respect intact. Eli wondered if he could say the same someday. A sharp crunch in the sand snapped him from his thoughts. He stopped, turning slowly. Small prints led up the beach, shoe prints, not his own, dragging faintly as though the person had been walking hurriedly or carrying something heavy. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. Someone had been here not long ago, though not close enough to see the container fully exposed. The sight sent a pulse of fear through his chest. He crouched and examined the prints more closely. The soles were patterned in a way he didn't recognize. They were too cleanly shaped, too sharp in some edges to belong to a fisherman's boot. A shiver crept across his shoulders. Whoever had left these tracks had not come here by chance. Maybe a hiker, maybe a beachcomber, or maybe someone who had been searching for the very thing he now guarded. The thought made his palms sweat. He straightened and looked back at the container, suddenly aware of how exposed it was. The sandbar shielded it from casual view, but anyone wandering along this stretch of coastline could stumble across it. Anyone looking for something could find it. If the men behind the smuggling operation were already scanning this part of the coast, as rumors at the port suggested, they would eventually find this beach. And if they found him with their stolen cargo, there would be no mercy. He walked back toward the container quickly, heart pounding with renewed urgency. He climbed inside once more, letting the door creak behind him as if it too were warning him to hurry. The artifacts seemed to glow faintly in the shifting light, the stone faces casting long shadows across the steel floor. Eli retrieved the sealed case of documents and sat near the entrance where the sunlight was strongest. He spent the next hour piecing together more fragments of information. The documents mentioned specific dates, movements of the container across docks in countries known for bribery and corruption, notes on avoiding customs checks, emails discussing high-priority assets that needed to be rerouted when a port became too risky. One thread referred to the container by a cryptic name, Package Delta. Another memo described a meeting gone wrong, a shipment being temporarily abandoned. The tone was cold, businesslike, as if the artifacts were nothing more than commodities. He found photographs, too. Some showed desert excavation sites roped off with makeshift tape, guarded by armed men. Others depicted dimly lit rooms filled with tables where artifacts were cleaned, polished, or packed in crates. Faces appeared in several images. Stern, expressionless men in suits or jackets, posing near illicit treasures as though they were victory trophies. Eli did not recognize any of them, but their presence sent a murmur of dread through him. These were not amateurs. They were not petty thieves. They were professionals who understood the value of what they stole and who likely would not tolerate interference. Panic tightened his throat as he considered what might happen if they discovered he had the container. He imagined engines roaring across the water, dark boats speeding toward the beach. He imagined men stepping out, faces masked or expressionless, demanding what belonged to them. He imagined being forced to choose between surrendering the pieces or risking his life, and the lives of the people he loved. The thought pushed him to his feet, suddenly restless. He paced within the container, weaving between towering artifacts, each step echoing faintly. His mind raced from one possibility to another. Could he hide the container better? No. It was too large, too heavy, too bright against the sand. Could he take a few small items and flee? No. He had nowhere to go. Could he pretend he never saw it? No one would believe him. He had dragged it ashore himself. It was his responsibility, whether he wanted it or not. The truth settled over him with sobering clarity. There was only one real choice. He had to contact the authorities, but even that felt fraught with danger. What if they suspected him of theft? What if they thought he was involved? He had touched the artifacts. He had moved them. He had opened the container. Would that matter? Would they trust him? Would they believe a poor fisherman who stumbled upon the find of a lifetime? Or would they assume he had some hidden motive? He closed his eyes, feeling the pulse of his heartbeat throbbing behind his ribs. The moral path was clear. The practical path was tangled, but he thought of his mother's frail hands, his daughter's quiet smile, and knew that he could not risk their safety by making the wrong choice. He returned to the entrance and stared at the ocean once more. He had always trusted the sea. It had taken from him, yes, but it had also provided. Maybe it had brought him this container for a reason, not to enrich him, but to force him to choose the person he wanted to be. The breeze rustled through the open doorway. Eli breathed deeply and made his decision. He would go to the authorities. He would tell them everything. He would give up the fortune he had found, even though it meant remaining the struggling fisherman he had always been. But he would do it with a clean conscience. He stood straighter then, grounding himself in the resolve he had just formed. The container behind him felt like a vast and ancient temple, its treasures watching him with silent judgment. He lifted the sealed case of documents, tucked it securely under his arm, and stepped out onto the sand. Yet, as he began the walk back toward his boat, a single thought lingered in the back of his mind, whispered by a voice he didn't recognize. Would the man searching for this cargo let him live long enough to tell anyone about it? Eli made his way back along the stretch of shoreline with the sealed case of documents tucked tightly against his chest, feeling as though the world had grown heavier around him. The decision he had made inside the container, to go to the authorities, to give up the fortune that could have changed everything, still sat raw and unsettled inside him, but it was firm. He was not a thief. He would not be the man who turned stolen history into personal gain. Yet, as he trudged toward the faithful star, the sand shifting under his boots with each step, fear seeped into the edges of his resolve like water leaking through cracked wood. He had chosen the right path, but the right path did not guarantee safety. He placed the case carefully inside the boat and sat for a moment on the worn bench, letting the wind cool his face. His heart was still beating too fast, each pulse a reminder of how precarious his situation had become. If anyone had seen him towing the container, or if anyone discovered it now on the sandbar, he would be drawn into a storm far larger than anything the ocean had ever thrown at him. And then there were the footprints, the unmistakable sign that someone else had passed through the area. Someone who did not belong here. The thought gnawed at him, refusing to let him breathe easy. He started the engine, and the familiar rumble steadied him slightly. As the faithful star moved away from the shore, he kept glancing over his shoulder, watching the container appear smaller and smaller behind him until it blended into the sand and shadow of the abandoned pier. He felt as though he were leaving behind not just a physical object, but a piece of his fate lodged firmly in the earth. The container was hidden for now, but it would not remain so forever. Riding the waves back toward town, he scanned the horizon more than usual. Every distant boat looked suspect, every shift in the water a possible threat. It was irrational, he knew, paranoia fueled by adrenaline and fear, but he could not shake the image of shadowy figures searching for the same treasure he had found. It was too valuable, too important to remain lost without consequence. Someone would come. Someone would look. The men who had gone to such lengths to steal history would not simply shrug and move on. When he reached the harbor, the usual quiet of the morning felt different, tinged with an uneasiness he had never noticed before. A few fishermen were mending nets near the dock, and old Raymond still sat on his bench, the thermos at his side steaming faintly. Yet Eli felt watched, though no eyes lingered on him longer than necessary. He forced himself to act normal. He tied up the boat, unloaded his gear, and nodded politely to those he passed. His body moved automatically, but his mind was still back on the beach, replaying every image of the artifacts inside the container and the dangerous implications woven into the documents he had read. He headed home first, needing to check on his mother before doing anything else. The house was still. The floorboards creaked softly under his boots. His mother lay sleeping, her face pale and tired but peaceful. A wave of guilt washed over him. How many times had he looked at her and wished he could give her the comfort she deserved? How many nights had he listened to her coughing, wishing he had more money, more strength, more luck? And now, when the universe had dropped a fortune at his feet, he had chosen to let it go. He sat beside her bed for several minutes, listening to her breathe. She stirred once, murmuring softly, but did not wake. Eli brushed a loose strand of hair from her face, then stood and walked into the kitchen. He looked around at the chipped countertops, the mismatched plates stacked near the sink, the nearly empty refrigerator. His hands tightened into fists at his sides. He was doing the right thing, he reminded himself. But doing the right thing had never felt so much like failing the people he loved. He opened the case again, spreading some of the documents across the kitchen table. The names, dates, and coded phrases seemed even darker under the humble glow of his single overhead bulb. He studied them with renewed determination, wanting to understand every detail before going to the authorities. He needed to be prepared. He needed to anticipate the questions they would ask. He needed proof that he was only a fisherman caught in the path of something far more dangerous than he could handle. Time slipped by quietly, the morning turning into midday. When he finally closed the case again, sealing the papers inside, he felt no more clarity than before, only a deeper awareness of the risk. Telling the authorities was the right thing, but it meant stepping into a world of investigations and consequences he had never imagined. What if they accused him of smuggling? What if they suspected him of stealing the artifacts? What if the criminals found him before he could reach the authorities? Every thought seemed to branch into a dozen fears. He needed to move. He needed to act before fear immobilized him. Eli tucked the case beneath his jacket and stepped outside, glancing up and down the street before locking the door. The town's narrow roads stretched in both directions, dotted with leaning telephone poles and houses that seemed half asleep. Nothing looked amiss, but the stillness unsettled him. It felt like the calm before a storm. He made his way toward the harbor again, intending to take the case directly to the small office used by the local Coast Guard. It wasn't far from the docks, and while they weren't equipped for major investigations, they were the first link in a chain that could lead to federal authorities. As he approached the harbor, however, he slowed. A sleek, unfamiliar boat was tied to the far end of the pier. It wasn't a military vessel, nor did it resemble the modest fishing boats scattered along the shoreline. The hull was dark, polished, its lines sharp and modern. A pair of outboard motors hinted at speed, real speed, the kind needed to cover large distances quickly and quietly. 3 men stood near it, speaking in low tones. They were dressed in casual clothing, but something about them was off. Their posture was too stiff, their movements too cautious. 2 of them had sunglasses, even though the sun was half hidden behind clouds. And none of them looked like they belonged here. Eli stopped where he was, instinctively stepping into the shadow cast by a building. His pulse quickened. The case felt heavier under his jacket. He couldn't hear what the men were saying, but their attention was fixed on a local fisherman, Pete Holloway, who was gesturing toward the open water as he spoke. Pete was no gossip, but he also wasn't the type to question strangers if they asked him about currents or debris. He probably assumed they were salvage workers or state officials. Eli watched as one of the men leaned closer to Pete, his questions quick and pointed. Pete shrugged and gestured again, pointing in the direction Eli had towed the container earlier that morning. The men nodded, exchanged a look, and thanked him before turning toward their boat. Cold dread slid down Eli's spine. They were searching for something. Maybe they didn't know that the container had reached the shore, but they knew roughly where it had been drifting. That was enough. They would follow the currents. They would follow the shoreline. They would find the sandbar eventually. Eli backed away slowly, careful not to draw attention to himself. He knew now that approaching the Coast Guard office with the case in his hands was too risky. If the men on the pier saw him go in, if they noticed the documents he carried, the situation could turn deadly before he had a chance to explain anything. He needed a different approach. He needed a plan that didn't involve walking directly into the open. He headed home again, this time taking a longer route through back alleys and side paths. The shadows lengthened as clouds drifted overhead, and the wind carried the faint scent of rain. By the time he reached the house, he was sweating despite the cool air. He shut the door behind him and locked it, leaning against the wood as he tried to calm the pounding of his heart. He placed the case on the table once more, staring at it with renewed intensity. If the men at the pier were connected to the smuggling ring, then he was already behind. They were actively searching the coastline. They would not stop until they found what they had lost, and if they learned he had hauled the container ashore, they would come for him. He knew that with bone-deep certainty. The thought spurred him into frantic motion. He rummaged through drawers and cupboards, searching for anything he could use as a hiding place. The house was too small, too bare. There were only a handful of places that might conceal the case, and none felt safe enough. It needed to be somewhere the criminals would not think to look, but where he could retrieve it quickly if needed. He finally chose a spot beneath the loose floorboard in his bedroom, a narrow space that had once stored letters and small keepsakes belonging to his father. It would hold the case if he angled it correctly. He pried up the board, slid the case inside, and lowered the wood again, checking to make sure it didn't look disturbed. Once it was hidden, he stepped back and took a shaky breath. For the first time since he had found the container, he felt truly alone against the enormity of what he faced. There were men searching. There were clues he couldn't erase. There were dangers closing in that he could neither predict nor control. He sat on the edge of his bed, hands clasped tightly, and forced himself to think. His plan had to change. The Coast Guard office was too exposed. He needed to reach the authorities another way, farther from town, maybe even from another port. He could take the faithful Star out at dusk, sail down the coast, and make for a larger harbor where he could disappear into the crowd long enough to share what he knew. But the evening was approaching faster than he anticipated, and with it came new complications. As the first hints of twilight settled over the rooftops, Eli heard the low, unmistakable hum of an engine passing through the neighborhood. He moved to the window cautiously and lifted the curtain just enough to see outside. A black SUV rolled slowly down the street. It was newer than any vehicle most locals could afford. Its windows were tinted dark enough to conceal whoever sat inside. It moved almost lazily, as though the driver had no particular destination, but Eli saw through the deception immediately. They were scouting, searching, watching. The SUV slowed near his house, paused for a breath of a moment, and then rolled on. Eli froze, barely daring to breathe until he heard the engine fade down the road. The noose was tightening. He could feel it with every beat of his heart. The time for hesitation was over. He needed to leave. Tonight. and he needed to figure out how to survive long enough to deliver the truth to someone who could protect him and stop the men now prowling the town. He stood, closed his eyes briefly, and gathered all the courage he had left. The battle he had tried to avoid was coming for him. There was no turning back now. Night fell over the town with the slow, deliberate weight of a curtain descending, darkening every street, every window, every corner that might have once felt safe. Eli sat motionless in the dim glow of a single lamp, listening to the soft ticking of the clock on the kitchen wall. His mother was asleep in the next room, her breathing shallow but steady, unaware of the danger tightening around their home like invisible ropes. The black SUV had passed by again an hour earlier, moving slowly, almost noiselessly, as though the men inside were in no hurry. Perhaps they weren't. Perhaps they already believed what they had come to suspect. Someone in this small, quiet town knew something, or had seen something, and now they were merely circling until they found the right house, the right face, the right chance to strike. Eli's palms were damp despite the cool night air. He wiped them against his jeans and forced himself to breathe evenly. He had made his decision to turn the container and its contents over to the authorities, but decisions meant nothing without action, and action meant leaving the house, exposing himself to whatever threat prowled the dark streets. The thought sent a tremor through him. He had never been a man who feared honest work or rough seas, but this kind of danger was different. Storms announced themselves. The ocean showed its temper, but men who trafficked in stolen cultures and buried their crimes behind false names were not so kind. They did not warn. They did not hesitate. Their violence was quiet and efficient, and Eli had no illusions about what they would do if they learned he had the case of documents hidden beneath his bedroom floor. He stood, extinguished the lamp, and paced toward his mother's room. She lay curled under a thin blanket, exhausted from the effort of merely existing through another day. The frailty of her frame, softened by the dim blue hue of moonlight, tugged at his heart. For a moment, he considered waking her, telling her everything, preparing her for some hurried escape. But then he imagined her fear, her questions, her confusion. Waking her now would achieve nothing but panic. She deserved rest, she deserved safety, though he could no longer be certain he could provide that. He closed her door softly and returned to the kitchen. The house felt smaller now, each shadow deeper, each sound sharper. He moved with deliberate slowness, gathering a few essential things: his jacket, the flashlight he had used in the container, a knife from the drawer. Not a weapon in any real sense, but better than nothing if he found himself cornered. He retrieved the case of documents from beneath the floorboard, checking once again that it was secure. His heart thudded painfully as he held it in his hands. This thin box might have been the heaviest thing he had ever carried. He slipped out the back door, locking it behind him, though he knew the lock was meaningless against men with enough determination. The night air was cool, brushing against his skin like a warning. He moved quickly along the side of the house, sticking close to the shadows, mindful of every leaf that crunched beneath his boots. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked in the distance, then fell silent. The town was oddly still, more silent than usual, as if holding its breath. Eli kept close to the walls as he walked, avoiding streetlights that might expose his silhouette. His goal was the harbor, but not through the main road. Instead, he took the long route, weaving behind houses and slipping between narrow alleys where garbage bins cast bulky shapes across the pavement. He listened constantly, every sense heightened, waiting for the growl of an engine or the crunch of tires on gravel. It wasn't until he reached the final corner before the pier that he stopped cold. The sleek boat he had seen that morning was still there, its dark hull gleaming faintly under the muted moonlight. One man stood near the bow, his arms folded, body motionless except for the slight rise and fall of breath. He looked like a statue carved from shadow. Another man sat on the railing, speaking quietly to the third. Their voices were too low for Eli to make out the words, but the tone carried the unmistakable cadence of impatience. They were still searching. And worse, they were waiting. If he approached the Coast Guard office now, or tried to reach his boat openly, they would see him. They might not recognize him immediately, but they would question him. They would follow him. They could corner him before he reached anyone who could help. The path he had hoped to take, sneaking onto the faithful star under cover of darkness and escaping toward a safer harbor, was no longer possible. His only option now was to disappear deeper into the dark and find another way. He stepped back slowly, his pulse racing. His feet carried him toward the edge of the harbor where a row of empty storage sheds stood. Most were locked, but he found one with a loose latch and slipped inside, closing the door quietly behind him. The interior smelled of mildew and old rope. A few broken crates lay scattered on the floor, remnants of long-discarded gear. Eli crouched behind them, pressing the case against his chest as though it were a shield. He waited. Minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. His mind raced through every possibility, every alternative. If he couldn't use his boat, could he leave by land? The highway out of town was 5 miles away, but he didn't have a car, and walking there with the case in hand would be risky. Someone could see him. The men in the SUV might already be patrolling. He could ask a neighbor for help, but anyone involved, even indirectly, could be endangered. And he had no idea whom to trust. The stakes were too high for misplaced faith. He thought of calling the authorities directly, but cell reception was unreliable in this part of town, especially near the harbor. And even if the call went through, how long would it take for help to arrive? Too long, he suspected. Far too long. He took another breath, willing himself to remain calm. He had faced storms before, storms that threatened to swallow his boat whole, storms that tossed him like driftwood. He had survived those. He could survive this too. But unlike the sea, these enemies would not retreat when the sky cleared. They would pursue him until the container was reclaimed and every loose thread tied off, including him. He stood slowly, deciding he needed to move. Sitting still would not keep him alive. He pushed open the shed door just enough to peer outside. The men were still on the pier, though one had begun pacing, tapping his foot impatiently. The boat's engines were quiet, but Eli sensed they did not intend to stay still much longer. Soon they would begin another sweep of the coastline. Soon they would search the sandbar and discover the container's presence. And then they would realize someone must have brought it there. Someone who lived nearby. Someone like him. The thought spurred him into motion. He slipped out of the shed and headed toward the far end of town, keeping to the darkest edges of alleys and backyards. The case dug sharply into his ribs with every step, but he could not risk loosening his grip. He moved past buildings whose windows reflected pale moonlight, past fences warped by years of storms, past silent houses where neighbors slept, unaware of the danger lurking in their streets. By the time he reached the outskirts of town, sweat dampened his shirt despite the cool air. His breath came harsh and uneven. He paused beneath a large willow tree that towered over a small patch of grass near the old water tower. From here, he could see the faint orange glow of the highway in the distance. It felt impossibly far. If he started walking now, he might make it in an hour, 2 at the most. But he would be exposed on the open road with no shadows deep enough to hide him. A single passing vehicle could ruin everything. He crouched behind the tree, running a hand through his hair, frustration and fear warring within him. He had never felt so cornered. He had never imagined that doing the right thing could demand so much courage. The thought of giving up crossed his mind briefly, of hiding the case somewhere distant and pretending he had never found the container at all. It would be easier, safer. But it would not be true to who he was. And it would not stop the criminals who would continue stealing from cultures already stripped bare. He closed his eyes and forced himself to think clearly. If he couldn't go by sea, and the main roads were unsafe, then perhaps the answer lay where the smugglers least expected him to go, into the marshlands to the north, where water trails cut through reeds, connecting to a small fisherman's cove rarely used anymore. It was a place his father had once shown him, a quiet inlet where the water was calm and the land thick with twisting paths. No one unfamiliar with the region would venture there at night, and tucked into the cove was a small, nearly forgotten service shack where the local Coast Guard stored basic supplies. It wasn't manned at night, but it had a radio powerful enough to contact the nearest patrol base 20 miles down the coast. If he could reach that shack, he could send a distress message without exposing himself in town. He straightened, feeling resolve settle back into place. It was dangerous, yes, but so was staying here. At least the marshlands offered cover, and the smugglers would not think to search that direction, not until too late. He adjusted the strap of the case beneath his jacket and moved toward the northern path. The trail was tangled and narrow, bordered by tall grass that swayed in the wind like restless fingers. Crickets chirped in the darkness. The air grew cooler as he progressed, carrying hints of brackish water. The mud sucked softly at his boots, marking each step with faint squelches. The shadows thickened, merging with the reeds until the world became a maze of moonlit silhouettes. Eli pushed forward, trusting the memory of his father's footsteps rather than his own fading sense of direction. He had followed this path only a handful of times in his life, and never at night. But desperation sharpened his senses. Each bend, each fork, each narrow rise felt familiar enough to guide him. At last, he smelled salt water again, not the open sea, but the gentle aroma of a sheltered inlet. The marsh opened into a small clearing where a shack stood near the water's edge. It leaned slightly to one side, as though bowing under the weight of years, and its wooden planks creaked in the wind. A faded emblem above the door marked it as official property. A shield, once vibrant blue, now chipped and pale. Eli approached cautiously, checking the surroundings for any sign of movement. The stillness reassured him. No boot prints marked the mud. No lights flickered in the distance. He reached the shack, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. The interior smelled of damp wood and old rope. A few shelves lined the walls, holding spare life vests and emergency kits. At the far end sat a metal desk, and atop it a radio unit with a small antenna angled toward the ceiling. Dust coated the knobs and buttons, but radios didn't need much to function. Just power, which came from the battery under the desk. Eli crouched and flipped the switch. The radio crackled softly, the static humming like a living thing. He adjusted the frequency, searching for a channel used by the Coast Guard base. After several attempts, he found one, faint but stable. He pressed the transmit button, his hand trembling. This is Elijah Brooks," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm a local fisherman. I have urgent information regarding a stolen cargo container. I need immediate assistance." Static responded. He waited, breath held tight, then tried again. "This is Elijah Brooks. I found something on the coastline, something dangerous. People are searching for it. I'm in danger. Anyone in the area, please respond." Static again. He swallowed and turned the knob, increasing the signal strength. A voice finally crackled through the speakers, muffled but clear enough. "Identify your location. Please repeat your location." Relief surged through Eli, but before he could respond, a sudden noise outside made him freeze, gravel shifting beneath a boot. He turned slowly toward the door, heart pounding so violently it stole his breath. A shadow passed across the window. The smugglers had found the cove. Eli reached toward the radio, but the voice on the line dissolved into static as footsteps approached the shack. His time had run out. He grabbed the case, clutched it tightly, and backed toward the rear exit, a flimsy door that led toward the water's edge. A hand jiggled the front door handle. He didn't wait. He bolted through the back door, sprinting toward the water as the shack door burst open behind him. Shouts erupted. Flashlights cut through the darkness. Eli plunged into the reeds, their sharp edges scraping his arms as he pushed forward. The ground squelched beneath him. He stumbled but didn't fall. The voices grew louder, converging behind him, but he didn't stop. He broke through a cluster of reeds and reached the shoreline where the water lapped quietly. Without thinking, he waded in until the cold seeped through his boots. A small skiff, a maintenance boat, rocked gently nearby, tethered to a half-submerged post. He lunged toward it, clambered aboard, and fumbled for the motor. Shouts rang out across the clearing. "Stop!" Eli pulled the starter cord. The motor sputtered weakly. The men pushed through the reeds. He pulled the cord again. The motor coughed. A flashlight beam swept across him. A gunshot cracked the night. The bullet struck the water near the skiff, spraying droplets across his face. He pulled the cord a third time, muscles screaming. The motor roared to life. He shoved the throttle forward. The skiff lurched into the dark water just as two men reached the shoreline, guns raised. But the marsh currents pulled him away quickly, shielding him behind walls of reeds. The men's shouts grew fainter. Another gunshot rang out, but the bullet whizzed harmlessly into the night. Eli didn't slow until the inlet widened and the cove turned into open marsh. His breath came in ragged gasps as he steered blindly through the shallow water, guided by the faint glow of distant stars. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed distance, safety, and time. The case lay beside him, still intact. He had survived, for now. Hours later, guided by the moon and memory, Eli emerged onto a larger stretch of coastline far from town. A Coast Guard patrol boat intercepted him soon after, having traced the distressed radio signal he had managed to send before fleeing. They pulled him aboard, weapons ready at first, then quickly softened when they saw his exhaustion, his trembling hands, and the case he guarded with unyielding grip. He told them everything. From the moment he found the container to the men pursuing him, he recounted every detail with unwavering honesty. The officers exchanged grave looks, understanding the scale of what he had stumbled upon. They escorted him to a secure facility farther down the coast. By sunrise, federal agents arrived, their expressions shifting from skepticism to shock as they examined the documents and heard his account. By midday, Search teams were deployed to secure the container. By evening, news vans began circling distant perimeters, catching wind of an international smuggling operation brought down by a fisherman from a dying town. Eli was granted protection and moved temporarily to a guarded location with his mother, who was bewildered and frightened, but safe. His daughter was flown in the next day. When she hugged him, relief almost brought him to his knees. The investigation unraveled quickly. Dozens of arrests, multiple countries involved, priceless artifacts recovered. Eli's name was kept anonymous at first for his own safety, but within weeks, whispers spread. The town learned of the brave fisherman who had uncovered something vast and dark and refused to be consumed by it. It took time for life to settle, but the authorities, in gratitude for his critical role, ensured that Eli received a substantial reward, enough to pay his debts, buy medicine for his mother, repair his home, and invest in a new fishing vessel, a vessel stronger and safer than the faithful Star, a vessel worthy of a man who had weathered storms far greater than the sea could offer. Months later, as calm waves lapped against the hull of his new boat, Eli stood on deck watching the sunrise. The horizon glowed gold, painting the water in shimmering hues. He breathed deeply, feeling peace settle into him like a long-lost companion returning home. He had not become rich in the way smugglers chased wealth, but he had gained something far more enduring. He had reclaimed his dignity, protected his family, and honored the memory of history stolen from nations across the world. The sea stretched before him, vast, unpredictable, but honest. For the first time in a long time, Eli felt hopeful. He started the engine and steered toward open water, ready for whatever the tide would bring next. Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe, watch the next videos, and share this story.